I'm Donald Wallenfang, Associate Professor of Theology at Walsh University in North Canton, Ohio, and the author of Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. Well, ever since I can remember, thinking back to my childhood and being brought up and going to Catholic school and having theology classes in 8th grade and things, I remember coming across Edith Stein's biography and reading about her life. And I remember being kind of stopped in my tracks with this woman, just seeing a picture of her and the seriousness and concentration of her look. I just knew right away that whatever she was about, she was serious about it. And then I came to find out what she was about was a passionate pursuit of truth. And she took a kind of interesting route in her life with many detours, seeking this truth, raised in a beautiful Jewish faith tradition, and then becoming a self-professed atheist in her teenage years, up into young adulthood and into her 20s. And then she was staying at a friend's house overnight, and she picked up this book off the shelf, and it was the Autobiography of Teresa of Vila. And she started reading it and became absorbed in the text, and at a certain point closed the book and said to herself, "This is the truth." And then she began to study more and more the Catholic tradition, and had another profound encounter with, I believe, a Lutheran friend, the wife of a man named Adolf Reinach, who was killed in the line of battle. And she went to visit his widowed wife, and she was struck by the hope that she still had, despite losing her husband so suddenly. And she referenced the cross and the resurrection of Christ. And Edith Stein was very moved by this. And so things like this really attracted her more and more to Christianity, and then the Catholic tradition in particular. And she was finally baptized at the age of 30, fully initiated into the Catholic Church, and several years later would become a Carmelite nun. And then finally, because of her both Catholic identity and Jewish identity, as circumstances would have it, would be deported to Auschwitz and die in a gas chamber August 9th, 1942. So all these different places in her life really grabbed my attention early on, and I wanted to be a disciple of her, because I too was someone who considered myself very passionate about what is true, and I was in search for authenticity wherever it could be found, and I really believed and still believe I found it in her life and her martyrdom, her witness to truth. I believe that the human being features so prominently in Stein's work because at the intersection of spiritual being and material being, you find the human being. And at the center of the human experience within the Christian tradition, you find Jesus of Nazareth, who is at once human and divine. And so I think for Edith, the human being began to serve as a real lens through which to view the fullness of human experience and pursuing the truth of the question of being in all its many facets. I think just as its geometric shape suggests, the cross is a place of intersection. It's a place of tension in so many ways. Something I write in this book is that the cross shows at once what it is to be human and what it is not to be human, all at the same time, the best and the worst that we human beings can perform. And so the cross is this great intersection of many things. And so I try to trace all of these various dialectical relationships, as I call them, between unity and plurality, between the self and the other, between manifestation and proclamation, between the sacred and the secular, between contemplation and ethics. And what's revealed in the cross is a paradoxical logic of being that we find traces of throughout the teachings of Christ and his parables in his very life that he lived. The cross is a symbol of all of this. It's a symbol of life lived for the other to the point of abandonment. It's a symbol where the impossible becomes possible and becomes possible again into eternity. That is, where suffering itself becomes the linchpin of redemption, where suffering is alleviated precisely in and through suffering, where death itself is put to death precisely through the experience of tragedy and death. The seeds of resurrection are born from this gift of self to the point of abandonment. And so I think if we're going to talk about what is it to be human, what is the universal human vocation, if there is one at all, we can't circumvent the cross. We can't sidestep it. We can't resist it. But I believe for Edith Stein, for everyone who would dare to follow Christ, as he said and teaches in the gospel, one must lean into the cross as the source of salvation. Metaphysics and phenomenology are a very unusual pairing for many reasons. When you read people writing phenomenology, they seem to be allergic to metaphysics. So when you read people writing metaphysics, they seem to despise phenomenology. So to bring these two approaches, these two, I would call them methods, together is quite an unusual move. And Edith Stein is one who was one of the first to really pioneer this kind of move, where she brings in close proximity metaphysics, and in particular Thomistic metaphysics, that of Thomas Aquinas, and the phenomenology she was immersed in with her mentor and master, Edmund Husserl. And she's able to hold these two methods together because she does not try to make a synthesis out of them. She lets each be what it is, but remain in conversation with one another. And therefore, I think she ends up with a real holistic depiction of being, of givenness, and what it is to be human. I find myself a bit pretentious in claiming to build on the work of such a great woman thinker such as Edith Stein. But nevertheless, I see her work as so relevant, meaningful, and important for our time, a time in which the culture in which we live seems to be heavily laden with this default worldview of material reductionism, that is, interpreting the whole of reality as matter in motion, and that is all. Being very much educated in natural science, but studying little philosophy, let alone theology. But Edith Stein is someone who I think is true to the meaning of the term science itself, derived from a Latin verb, scire, which means to know about anything. And so Edith's work encompasses the fullness of reality, the fullness of possibility, the fullness of human experience. So when I think about what I might add to her work, it includes this possibility that I may say something to help extend her work, augment her work in some way. And I think, first of all, it comes down to trying to make her own work accessible to a greater audience, trying to distill her own theological anthropology, try to see how she's at work pursuing this question, what is the human being, in a kind of systematic presentation. That's the first thing I hope to do. And the second is to try to put the accent where I think it should be in the full scope of her life and work, and that is toward the end of her life, when she becomes a Carmelite nun and is enmeshed in this world of Carmelite spirituality, and she writes her magnum opus, which is Finite and Eternal Being, and her final text called The Science of the Cross, which is a commentary on the work of St. John of the Cross, this master of the Carmelite spiritual tradition. So I try in my own work to really observe carefully the shift that occurs later in her life and work, and to magnify what's going on there.